Toward midnight, he set off, passed through the Bourbonnais, wishing to avoid Mousson, where the Republican Club had exasperated the aristocratic classes. From the very first day of his arrival at Paris, the general-in-chief applied himself to avoid the ideas of the multitude who were so desirous of seeing him and expressing their enthusiasm. His interview with the Directory was cold and unceremonious. The members that composed it at that time were Barras, General Moulin, and Groyer, who shared the same sentiments. Sieyès and Roger Ducos were in opposition. It was said at that time that the two latter, despairing of being able to maintain the Republican system and wishing to prevent, at any rate, the reestablishment of the Bourbons in France, had cast their eyes on a prince of the House of Spain, whose power would have been circumscribed in such narrow limits that liberty and all the principles of the Revolution would have been in safety. Whatever may be the truth of that anecdote, it is, however, certain that these two directors, when they explained to General Bonaparte the disposition of the people's minds and the impossibility of continuing any longer under the directorial form of government, entreated him to put himself at the head of an insurrection that might overthrow it, a feeling of affection that the general had preserved for Barras persuaded him to make some indirect overtures to that director to draw him into his party. Barras refused, either because he had entered into secret engagements with the House of Bourbon, or rather by want of enlightened views, and by the Republican sentiments he could not decide to give up. It became therefore necessary to do without him, and moreover to take a speedy resolution. France was oppressed by the expenses of the war and disgusted with a violent government which, perceiving that its enemies were augmented from day to day and wishing to place in the same predicament the disaffected that its administration created with its inveterate enemies of the aristocratic classes and the families of the emigrants, loaded all indiscriminately with the same rigor, the fear of the influence of the emigrants, and of a return to the monarchical system made the directors lean towards those rigorous measures that had caused the success of the Committee of Public Welfare, and most of their acts bore the marks of these measures. Their partisans, that were no longer to be found anywhere else than among a part of the public officers, were perpetually exciting their anxiety on the spirit of the army, and General Bonaparte in particular inspired them with alarms that could not fail to soon produce a violent attack against him. These partisans of the Directory formed, nevertheless, everywhere a minority, and especially in the two councils, but their activity and their audacious spirit compensated for the smallness of their numbers. The general-in-chief arrived on the 26th of Vendemiaire. The conspiracy that was to overturn the Directory was arranged and decided in the first days of Brumaire, and several members of the two councils had been entrusted with the secret. Government, wishing, however, to show General Bonaparte a public testimony of satisfaction, resolved to give him a splendid dinner. It was decided that the board should be spread in the nave of the Church of Saint-Sulpice. Arrangements were made to bring together the two councils and all the high officers of the state. The general-in-chief went there with a few generals and with his staff. An immense table in the form of a horseshoe filled the whole church. The general-in-chief sat next to the president of the Directory. He trusted so little to the good faith of the government that he ordered a loaf of bread and half a bottle of wine to be brought there for his private use. I had not been previously informed of that circumstance, and I only learned it when Duroc asked me in the church for those 2 articles of provisions which were fetched from the general's coach. I never witnessed a more silent assembly, nor one where the guests showed less confidence and cheerfulness. Scarcely anyone addressed his neighbor, and those who were in the secret of the plot preferred not to speak rather than to risk dangerous conversation with neighbors who might differ in opinion with them. The toasts that were given were received with that enthusiasm and even the one meant for General Bonaparte. So deeply were the minds of everyone prepossessed with their own private thoughts. After having sat for about half an hour, the general got up, walked slowly round the tables, addressed a few words to the guests, escaped by a side door, and was back at his own lodgings before anyone had observed his absence. The most celebrated general officers of the army were at the time nearly all at Paris. Moreau, MacDonald, Bournonville, generals-in-chief, had entered into the plot. Augereau, member of the Council of 500, had not been made acquainted with it, nor Bernadotte. The opinions of the latter were rather violent, and a feeling of jealousy, the cause of which was not extremely honorable to them, had rendered them both enemies of General Bonaparte. His having formerly commanded in Paris ensured him the friendship of all the officers of the staff, whilst the colonels of the regiment had held garrison in the metropolis, were all equally devoted to his person, notwithstanding the precautions that had been taken to keep the whole affair a secret. It had, however, spread among the higher classes and almost all the military residing in Paris. The 3 members of the Directory learned it also, and then for the first time the force of public opinion made them start back before the measures they might so easily have taken to annihilate the conspiracy. It would undoubtedly have been sufficient to have apprehended the general during the night, but then what would they have done with him? How would they have made out any charge against him? Where would they have found judges? The general-in-chief was so sensible of his real situation that he took no precaution whatever for his personal security. He was surrounded by nobody but his aides-de-camp. He seldom went out and worked principally with Roeder, in whom he placed his chief confidence. On the 16th of Brumaire, there was so little appearance of the plot bursting the following day that Eugène and I passed the evening at a ball, where he remained a part of the night, and I left at midnight because that was the hour when my duty began. The next morning at 6 o'clock, the 60 officers on duty in the quarter were assembled in the courtyard of the general's house in the Rue de la Victoire. The general explained to them in a forcible manner the desperate situation of the Republic and asked of them a testimony of devotion to his person with an oath of allegiance to the 2 chambers. He then mounted his horse and flew to the carousel, where he found Sebastiani at the head of his regiment, the 5th Dragoons. On entering the Tuileries, he also found the guards of the Directory, whom their colonel had brought to remain at the disposal of the Council of the Elders. The Minister of the War Department had, nevertheless, 2 days beforehand strictly prohibited the chiefs of the different corps from making the slightest movement without his orders, under pain of death. But besides the little esteem and confidence with which that minister, Dubois de Conseil, inspired, the troops were delighted on finding themselves placed under the command of General Bonaparte. Their enthusiasm was so great that they would not have hesitated a moment to fire on the Directory if they had received an order to that effect. General Bonaparte presented himself at the bar of the elders, where Monsieur le Mercier was in the chair. He there received a decree by which he was appointed general-in-chief of the troops of the 1st Division, and an order to march next day to Saint-Cloud, where the 2 councils were holding their sitting. In fact, the following day, the majority of the 2 councils assembled in the palace of Saint-Cloud. The general had required Monsieur Guerrier, president of the Directory, to tender his resignation, but he refused, and as a lawyer, the reason he gave was that the order was contrary to the Constitution. His wife remained with Madame Bonaparte, and they were obliged to work upon her alarm to obtain her husband's submission. The Council of Elders, not being very numerous, had been easily accommodated in one of the large apartments, but the Council of 500, which was to sit in the conservatory, had not yet been able to assemble because the preparations were not completed. In consequence, the sitting did not open until 3 o'clock. Lucien Bonaparte was in the chair. Great excitement prevailed. The friends of the Directory seemed to be more numerous than the day before. They all showed themselves indignant at a measure which, bearing all the characteristics of a coup d'etat, presented besides what they called liberticide violence and an odious violation of the Constitution. Scarcely had the debates begun when one of the members proposed that each individually should mount the tribune and swear allegiance to the Constitution of the year 3. The general had given me orders to remain in the hall and bring him every 5 minutes a report of what was going forward. The ceremony of the oath was undoubtedly meant to gain time and prolong the sitting until night should fall. In the space of 5 minutes, no more than 3 oaths were taken, so that it was evident more than 5 hours would elapse before the ceremony was terminated. I acquainted General Bonaparte with the circumstance and found him walking with much agitation in an apartment that had no other furniture than 2 armchairs. Sieyes was alone with him, sitting next to the chimney before a burning faggot, which he was poking with a stick, for there was not even a pair of tongs. After having listened to what I had to say, General Bonaparte turned abruptly to Sieyes and observed, "Now you see what they are doing." "Oh, answered the other coolly. "To swear to a part of the Constitution may be right, but to the whole Constitution, that is too much." I retired to the adjoining apartment, where I found about 30 officers of the staff and General Berthier in the midst of them. All their faces were lengthened, and they looked gloomy. When I told General Berthier what was going forward at the 500, he grew pale and heaved a sigh. But all of a sudden, the folding door opened, and General Bonaparte appeared, beating the floor with a whip and exclaiming, "This must have an end!" They all rushed out, and we soon found ourselves at the entrance of the courtyard, where a regiment of infantry just arrived from Paris were ranged in line of battle. He assembled the officers, harangued them for a few minutes, and then, turning his horse's head, he galloped back to the foot of the great staircase, which he rapidly ascended, and presented himself to the bar of the Council of Elders. The speech he made there was faithfully reported in the papers of the time, but his agitation of mind was carried to such a pitch that he hesitated, and his words were uttered with an utmost disorder. When he arrived at that part of his speech where he mentioned that a great plot had been formed against liberty, one of the members of the council said coolly to him, "General, you must reveal that plot." Instead of answering him, the general continued still in a little confusion. But at last, recovering his presence of mind, he went on with a firmer voice and finished his speech. One part of the council had shared his emotion. The other, on the contrary, enjoyed his confusion. And as the council was to deliberate on what he had said, he withdrew. But instead of returning to the place he had come from, he went to the council of 500. In the vestibule, he found the grenadiers, who took up arms. The noise they made alarmed the assembly, and when Bonaparte presented himself, a great number of members rushed forward to meet him with angry cries, among which one might have distinguished the word dictator. He was so pressed between the deputies, his staff, and the grenadiers who had rushed to the door of the apartment that I thought for a moment he would be smothered. He could neither advance nor go back. At last, those who had accompanied him felt that it was necessary to open a passage for him, and they succeeded, though not without violent efforts. He then went down to the courtyard, mounted his horse, and remaining at the foot of the staircase, he sent an order for the president to come to him, which the latter did as soon as he could escape. In the meanwhile, the confusion in the assembly was carried to the highest pitch. Several members, rushing forward to the windows which opened into the courtyard, pointed to him and cried out, "Down with the dictator! Let him be outlawed!" At that moment, Monsieur de Talleyrand, Arnaud, the poet, and some other persons with whom I was talking suddenly turned as pale as death. They all fled, except those I've named. The terrible word of outlaw, or la loi, still possessed all of its magic force, and if a general of some reputation had put himself at the head of the troops of the interior, it would be difficult to guess what might have happened. But the general took a resolution and gave Murat orders to clear the hall. Murat placed Colonel Dujardin at the head of a detachment of grenadiers who crossed the hall at a quick pace. When the colonel was at the end of the hall, he turned round towards the members who filled the benches. But these, getting out by the windows, disappeared and laid down their costume, which consisted of a sort of Roman toga with a square cap. When General Bonaparte entered the hall of the Council of 500, one of the grenadiers who had followed him received a thrust from a dagger which penetrated his coat, and which in all probability had been meant for the general. The grenadier was rewarded and I think died a captain. The deputy marked out as an assassin was a Corsican called Arena. He perished a short time after, being implicated in the conspiracy of which Coraci and Tobino Lebrun were at the head, and the object of which was to assassinate the first consul at the Opera in the midst of the confusion they intended to create by letting off squibs. Having left France a few days after the 18th Brumaire, I could obtain no particulars of the affair. Immediately after the expulsion of the deputies, the members of the two councils who had been appointed to consult on the measures that were to be taken met, and on the 19th, the city of Paris, and soon after all the rest of France, learned that General Bonaparte had been created first consul, and that Messieurs Commissaire and Lebrun were to be second and third consuls with him. The former had been a magistrate in the Parliament of Aix. He was celebrated for his thorough information and his conciliating temper. He had sat in the convention, and his mitigated vote in the king's trial gave the true measure of the weakness of his disposition. The third consul, Monsieur Lebrun, was said to have written the beautiful ordinances of Chancellor Maupeou, whose secretary he had been. He was a very well-informed man, and published two remarkable translations, one of the Iliad and the other of Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered. He had the reputation of being a great financier. The discernment of the first consul in appointing him was universally applauded. The minister of police at that period was Monsieur Fouché, subsequently Duke of Otranto. On the 17th Brumaire, he had pledged his word to General Bonaparte to serve him unreservedly. But on the 18th, as I was walking up and down the apartments of Saint-Cloud, I met one of my old schoolfellows named Thoreau, whom I had not seen since I left college. He told me that he was Secretary General of the Police, and I questioned him rather in a pressing manner. He confessed that his master had sent him to Saint-Cloud to witness the event, and that we must succeed at any cost, as he was well enough acquainted with his patron to know he would make us pay our failure dearly. In truth, we learned since that the minister had taken measures to have us apprehended and perhaps shot if the undertaking at Saint-Cloud had not completely succeeded. The emperor learned that circumstance, and knowing his own strength, he used sometimes to joke with his minister about it. Although I had not kept up my connections with the family of Metternich, the first consul, hoping to press the Austrians so closely that peace would be the consequences of the first campaign, sent me to Saxony with secret powers to sign an armistice in case the events of the war should incline the Austrians that way. The expulsion of the late government caused no manner of regret to the public, though the terms of that expulsion created some anxiety. Notwithstanding the violence of the preceding governments, the nation was not yet accustomed to them. She had not forgotten the aim towards which all of her exertions had been directed for the last 12 years, the establishment of liberty founded on solid and respected laws. She found, however, in the new constitution none of those securities she was entitled to expect, although the first consul crowned the country with his own glory. And though his genius left him no fears for its independence, France wished to find in the result of victory all the advantages of peace and all the wealth of industry and trade. Therefore, when the periodical press was consulted on the question of the consulate for life, an immense majority of citizens expressed their approbation in a most striking manner, convinced that a lasting magistracy offered to their interests a greater security. One of the earlier measures of the first consul was to send new diplomatic agents to foreign countries. To me, he entrusted a mission to Dresden, ordering me immediately after my arrival to write to Vienna that I had powers to treat for a cessation of hostilities in the case of the cabinet of Vienna should prefer addressing itself to me. The conditions were in the form of preliminaries of peace. The circumstances of the war on the Rhine hastened its conclusion, and it was signed after the Battle of Hohenlinden by the under chief of the staff of Moreau.